what I really loved about MCP was like, number one, it was this open source thing. Like, so like it wasn't like one company trying to create a proprietary platform that would like accrue all the wins, all the gains to like that one company. Like this was like, MCP felt like the evolution of the internet ecosystem, where it's like everything's open. Everyone builds their own things and connects on their own terms. The ease of using auth is something of a blocker for mass remote adoption, and like the still moving spec for a lot of people. Like even now, right? Like there's this whole narrative around like how painful dynamic client registration is and so on. Yeah. And so like, and there's movement to like fix that, and like there's solutions that are on the way, like the client metadata document and so on. But it's all bleeding edge stuff. And so like, I think like until that starts to stabilize, like remote will continue to have a bit of a bumpy road. Yeah. The future is not just the centralized mechanism, but there will also be a like .well-known URI approach to this, where when you're on a website, you should be able to go to a .well-known URI and be like, oh, this MCP server corresponds to this website. Yeah. And like, I'm really excited about that, because that brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Like that whole narrative of like, okay, I have this vision that like almost every website should have an MCP server in some way, shape, or form. LLMs are so powerful in being able to like distinguish like when they should do X versus Y. Like you don't need nearly as much granularity as like a typical open API spec does. So instead of giving like 20 different create, read, update, delete endpoints on all your like basic building blocks, what you're actually probably doing is defining like many MCP servers I think should be one tool.
Oh, wow.
That's my hot take.
Hey, welcome to Scalekit podcast. I'm Ravi, one of the co-founders of Scalekit. Scalekit is an auth stack for AI applications. Today, we are excited to have Tadas, one of the co-creators of MCP Pulse, and also key maintainers of official MCP registry. Tadas, we're so excited to have you here.
Thanks, Ravi. Appreciate it.
So before we even go deep into MCP and the MCP registry, I want to know more about, you have started as an engineer and you have done a lot of career transitions along the way. I want to understand what drew you to those journeys and what was the journey like over the last few years for you?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think I did like one major pivot in the middle, but it was a pretty big one. So like I started as a software engineer. I worked for, my first job out of school was at Goldman Sachs, big corporate, like just learned all the basics of like working in a big enterprise, like being a software engineer there. But then like the startup world always drew to me. And so like slowly, like my first job after Goldman Sachs was the complete opposite. Like I went to like a 3-person startup. I was the first employee. We had no idea what we were doing, right? Like early 20s, like just kind of like trying a bunch of things, making all the classic startup mistakes, but like definitely got the startup bug. And I was like, this is the kind of place that like I want to spend most of my career. And so like ended up just like going to like then a mid-sized company when I moved to San Francisco, and like was on that engineering track, but ultimately decided I want to do my own thing. Like I want to go back to that like early stage startup world. And I made from like that mid-stage startup, I was like, I want to go off on my own. Like I don't want to make the same startup mistakes of like building a product that nobody wants, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, I just want to make revenue from day one. I'm going to be a consultant of some sort. And I had been like doing some like side projects in the marketing world and like SEO world. And I thought I knew what I was doing in that world. I was like, oh, like marketing, easy. Like I'm an engineer, I can do anything. And then quickly, as I started to try to like land my marketing clients, like it was like, I realized I had a lot to learn, but like over the course of like a year and a half, like turned that into like that ambition into like an SEO consulting business. So it was just me. I worked with a bunch of contractors and so on, but like built this like kind of second career skill. Like I learned my mission at the time was like, I know how to build things. Now I'm going to learn how to sell things as a marketer. And so for a while, I kind of put my engineering skills on the shelf for like a year, built this marketing skill set, and slowly realized that my sweet spot was where I could use both skills. And that's where I ended up doing like a lot of like SEO growth consulting for early stage tech startups, where I worked with a lot of engineering teams, marketing teams, product teams, and kind of got to continue to wear a bunch of different hats and use like the handful of years of both engineering and marketing experience as I did that. But I guess your next question is probably going to be, how did that lead me to MCP, right?
Yeah. But before I actually do that, I think this is extremely hard to understand how difficult marketing can be, especially if you're coming from an engineering background. You kind of
learn the hard way.
You kind of underestimate how much effort it takes to take your product out there and then put it in front of so many people whom you want to actually see. But I think now you're in a great spot where you have skills from both builder world and also the selling world. I think it's a very unique skill set to have.
Yeah.
I definitely want to go to that. How do you get into MCP at all completely?
Yeah. So then the next step was I was doing this consulting, and I met this guy, Mike, who's my co-founder, co-creator of Pulse MCP. We worked on some clients together, and then at some point he was like, "Hey, I have these like marketing business ideas. Like, why don't we go work together on this thing?" And like we engaged. He and I started working together. We worked on a handful of projects, some successful, some not. And made some money, and then we were like looking for our next project idea because like these were kind of like shorter term, I won't get into it. Not as interesting for this audience, but long story short is we were looking for our next project. It was November 2024, and we had been starting to use like AI in our workflows and things like that, and we loved Anthropic as a company, and we're like, hey, they just released this cool thing, MCP, and they released it like 2 days ago. Nobody's talking about it.
Yeah.
This is like. This solves so many problems that like we're seeing as we're trying to use AI. We're seeing like all this. Like the big thing to me is like I wrote a blog post about this. It was the first PulseMCP.com blog post. But like to me, like existential threat to the internet was just like, okay, if all these AI companies are going to crawl all this stuff out there, and then like that breaks like the ads model of the internet. So like now like there's no incentive for creators to create things if it's all just getting slurped up and baked into these models and answered like on the fly, and then like these creators never get compensated and so on. Which it's funny talking about this now because like a month ago, Cloudflare and like a bunch of others have made this big push like basically around this exact topic.
Yeah.
So we can talk more about that later. But and like they're solving it in a slightly different way than I kind of envisioned up front when we were like, oh, MCP is the solution. But like to me, like what I really loved about MCP was like number one, it was this open source thing. Like so like it wasn't like one company trying to create a proprietary platform that would like accrue all the wins, all the gains to like that one company. Like this was like MCP felt like the evolution of the internet ecosystem where it's like everything's open. Everyone builds their own things and then connects on their own terms. Like you kind of flip whereas like when an AI crawler is going to a website and slurping everything up, it's like very it's the AI company is in control and the
publisher is at a loss. He's doing all the hard work of generating original content, but then
they have no control
to monetize it. Yeah,
right. And they have no control. They can't do anything. They can't do much about it. Like they can, in theory, be like, "Oh, you're violating our terms of service," but like it's so hard to anyway. Versus like MCP servers flip that on its head, right? It's like okay, like we've built an MCP server for our service. These are the terms under which AI interacts with our service, and to me that flips the incentive model. Back the right way, I guess. So like these creators now they can do what they want. Like they can serve ads through their MCP server or embed them in some way. They can serve affiliate links. They can do all these things that I think like can be in theory, again, super early days. Like, we still haven't solved, we haven't seen too many examples of those exact problems being solved. But like in theory, this was the architecture that would enable this incentive flip. And that's what got me really excited. Like that's why I felt like, okay, this is the solution to this like AI is taking over too many things problem. MCP democratizes that capability.
Yeah, I think it's a great way of putting it, right? MCP kind of democratizes the ability for any user to take help of LLMs and not just do Q&A, but actually interact with the real applications that they're using. And MCP kind of made it so easy for MCP builders to have control over what they want to expose or what they don't want to expose. And it's a great way of putting it. So you also spoke about one point where this is like an alternative, I wouldn't say alternative, this is kind of modern internet built on the same principles of openness, built on the same principles of inclusivity, built on the same principles of creating an ecosystem around it rather than being a closed source proprietary kind of a protocol. Did the adoption of MCP surprise you, and did the embracement of MCP as a protocol by everyone, including their competitors like OpenAI, Google, did that kind of surprise you?
I think it actually did not. I think it's funny because like we were on it in that first week, and we're like we're gonna basically bet our careers on this. Like within a month, we were working pretty close to full time on it, and I think like there were a few ways I thought it could go, and like. When I was thinking about like, all right, what Mike and I were brainstorming, like, how could this play out? And like, there were a few paths. I was like, one path is like, all the major AI labs just adopt this and it just becomes a de facto standard. And to the point where almost people stop talking about it in the way that nobody talks about HTTP these days, right?
Yeah.
So another way it could go is like there might be one holdout. Like maybe OpenAI is just going to be like, we have market share, so like we're just not going to adopt this and we're going to do our own thing, and everyone else is just kind of play catch up and see, and like it becomes this big war, right?
Yeah.
And so like, I thought that was a possibility, right? And so I was definitely extremely happy and surprised when relatively early in this arc, like OpenAI was like, no, we're in. Like, I thought that was awesome. So like huge credit to OpenAI for not fighting that and just being like, all right, we're going to join the steering committee. We're going to put all our eggs in this basket too. So definitely appreciate how everyone ended up taking the path that I think was beneficial to everyone.
Exactly. I think it kind of fulfills the openness principle of the MCP with which they even started with. Even though OpenAI had their own kind of function calling, which is their own version of kind of giving action ability to the LLMs. They kind of, even though we had it, we're still going to adopt MCP as an official protocol, with which we can support the responses API and things like that. I thought that's great move from OpenAI to make sure that the adoption of MCP as a protocol evolves from just being an Anthropic's own protocol to the standard protocol that every model should support going forward. Tell me more about Pulse MCP. Why did you start Pulse MCP? Because in the original days of MCP, there's a lot of uncertainty about what is MCP, how do you build an MCP server, because there are not a lot of MCP clients out there that are supporting this protocol. So what led to the generation of Pulse MCP?
Yeah, definitely a good question. I think like in those first few weeks in that late November time period when we were like, oh, this thing is happening. What do we do? What can we build in this space? Had tons of ideas, as you can imagine. And then like fundamentally, and a lot of other people had the same idea. We were like, well, there's no registry of MCP servers. Like we got to build one of these, or like we're seeing these being created, and like all we see is like a GitHub repository with like 15 of them listed. So and like PRs being opened every day. I'm like, okay, clearly there needs to be a web app for this, and there's enough traction that like this needs to be created. Of course, as we start building it and release it like 2 days later, there's already like 3 more like around that same time period. So like everyone had the same idea. So like it certainly wasn't a unique insight. I'm not going to pretend that it was, but that was just kind of like, all right, this thing needs to exist. No idea how we would monetize it. No idea whatever, but like just as like a kind of foundational building block for like what's out there, a server registry needs to exist. And so we were just like we weren't taking the mindset of like, we need to build a business around this. This was like, we have some runway from like the last stuff we were doing. Let's take at least a few months and just build something that's like useful for the community. We'll get eyeballs, and we'll, maybe like at one point we were considering just like, oh, let's just make all of Pulse open source and like contribute it to like the official repositories in some way, or like, morph it into the official registry. Like we made that offer once to the Anthropic folks, and ultimately didn't end up going that path. And so like now we're turning into a business. But like back in the early days, like it was just like, this is a cool project. We have some runway. Let's play in this space. Let's get involved in the like open source side of it and with like the steering committee and whatnot. And we can talk more about that journey too. Pulse MCP was certainly born as just like community project that we're going to put out there because it just should exist, and we'll see where that takes us from there. Maybe we'll like one loose idea we had is like, oh, let's start paying attention to what servers are getting traction, so that like MCP servers are this new kind of app. Like maybe that's the thing that we'll be able to monetize. And like we'll know what people are interested in, so like what we should build and so on. Still a possible idea in the back of our head, but that was the genesis. Community project, the obvious kind of thing that was needed at the time. And it continues to be used in the way that like from like that first week that we built it. So happy to continue maintaining it, and we have I can talk about like future direction for Pulse MCP too. But that's the genesis at least.
When the MCP protocol came in, there were a lot of people building a lot of MCP servers. But again, the spec itself evolved over the next 6 months. Like a couple of things that were not included in the original part of the spec was the HTTP as a protocol, right? It was all STDIO, etc., right? And then auth was not included in the protocol. I mean, they knew it is needed, but building auth is not easy as part of the protocol because it needs to serve for so many use cases, so many enterprise environments and enterprise requirements. There are 2 things that I felt were game-changing. One is HTTP, streamable HTTP, evolution of protocol support from STDIO to SSE to streamable HTTP. I thought that's a great evolution for the protocol itself. And the second is authentication and OAuth as kind of recommendation for the streamable HTTP. So how did you see, because you were closely involved from the initial days of the MCP and through the spec evolution, what were your observations and what were your kind of reactions on how the spec is growing and how the spec is evolving?
Yeah, I think, I'm going to take it kind of point by point. I think actually XSC was in the initial spec, but like nobody used it because like the first 20 reference servers were all SCDIO, and there was like kind of unclear exactly how you build an SSC server. There's maybe some lack of definition about like some of the details and so on. Yeah. I think like David and Justin, the creators, surely had in mind that this would go into HTTP or remote servers at some point, and like proposed SSC initially, and then there's the whole arc about like how that turned into streamable HTTP. So I think that was always in mind for the protocol. I do think like to like David and Justin's and like everyone else's involved in the early days credit, and like they very quickly realized, like people care about this. It's not just like this project that we threw out there that they thought might be the case, right? Yeah. Like especially in the first few weeks after its launch, like it didn't get a whole ton of traction. Yeah. As you would expect from like a big Anthropic announcement. And so like, I think as it started to pick up traction very quickly, it was clear that like Anthropic and the other folks involved were like auth is a priority. Yeah. And so then like some great people got really involved really early, like, like Den from Microsoft, he's been spearheading a lot of that. Aaron from Okta, like they've been doing awesome work from like very early days. Yeah. To shore that up, and like more better than I do for sure at this point of like just how hairy all that stuff gets, and so like just how much effort has been being poured into like creating this new way of authenticating on the internet. Like I really liked one of Aaron's posts that he made. I forget in what context it was, but it's just like, or maybe it was a Microsoft post. I forget who posted it, but like the idea that like auth for agents is this like new thing, right? Like it's not. It's something in between auth for humans and auth for like service accounts and machine-to-machine communication. It's this like agent acting on behalf of a human. So like there's this new layer of privilege that needs to be built, and like the security folks are like constantly at the bleeding edge of like the auth spec. Like I often see like Aaron being like, like there's this brand new RFC coming out and like OAuth, and like actually we need to make that a core part of the MCP spec. It's crazy like how bleeding edge it all is. Huge kudos to all the folks that have been pouring so much. Like, I feel like half of like the MCP spec evolution effort is just going into that. Yeah, that's just like I haven't been super involved in the auth conversations myself, but I have mad respect for all the folks that are doing so much for it. But yeah, remotes is interesting. Like I feel like remotes are like, the remotes are taking a lot longer to take off than I thought they would initially. Exactly. Like I was kind of like, okay, like SCDIO is cute, and like this will be the thing for a few months while like the remote stuff gets more definition and so on. But I feel like we're still at the point where local is probably more popular than remotes, which is super surprising to me. Yeah, I think like there's kind of two things going on there. One is like I think like auth is still something of a blocker, like for the ease of using auth is something of a blocker for mass remote adoption, and like the still moving spec for a lot of people. Like even now, right? Like there's this whole narrative around like how painful dynamic client registration is and so on. Yeah. And so like there's movement to like fix that, and like there's solutions that are on the way, like the client metadata document and so on. But it's all bleeding edge stuff, and so like I think like until that starts to stabilize, like remote will continue to have a bit of a bumpy road. Yeah. But then the other kind of like the kind of positive surprise has been just how useful local servers are. Yeah. Like I find myself like and I would caveat that with they're useful for software engineers, right?
Not for distribution of your product to your customers, because right. You can't expect them to download and installable in your laptop.
Right. If your customers are not software engineers, right? Like it's you want the remote thing. You don't really have another option. But like just how valuable, like just the like in the same way that like I don't know, like coding is such a big use case for LLMs, like local MCP servers are such a great use case for software engineers, and it's a pretty big market out there. Yeah. And so like that alone is holding up the relevance of local servers, and I think will forever, because like I think local servers aren't going anywhere. Yeah. Because there's even like when I have as a software engineer, when I'm like hooking something up to like my IDE. My MCP client, like I often, given the choice of like taking a URL for a remote server or using the npm package via SCDIO, I often choose the SCDIO one, because I'm like, I want to lock in the version number so that like it doesn't change on me, so that I have like reproducible patterns and so on. So I think SCDIO servers are here to stay. I'm surprised, or not surprised. I just kind of expected remotes to go faster, but I understand why they haven't.
Yeah.
I think there's, we're still at 1% of the, probably
Overall
less
MCP
of like how much impact MCP will have as those things stabilize and as like, the remotes start to reach the masses in a way that like, SDDIO never could. As big as SDDIO is today, it will never reach that audience.
So the way I think about SDDIO and remote is more of SDDIO is more like in the early 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, where you would download applications on your device and then execute them.
Yeah.
And the kind of, when web exploded, everyone is able to just use the internet. If they don't have to download anything, they can just type a URL and get buy books or do something that they want to do without having to install anything. That's how I look at the SDDIO versus remote. SDDIO definitely has a huge number of MCP servers built on top of that. But the real mass adoption will happen once more and more MCP server builders adopt remote HTTP, because it makes the distribution easy, it makes security easy. They'll be in more control of what versions that they're deploying, what optimization that they're doing to the tooling and things like that.
Yeah.
So I definitely see that parallel there from desktop applications to web and SDDIO to remote MCP servers. Let's move on to the security bit of it. One of the things that gained a lot of scrutiny is around prompt injections, around, hey, how do you know the MCP server that you're actually installing or using is actually secure? How do you know that it's not exfiltrating some of your credentials or your data? So what was your thought process when people started coming up with all sorts of these vulnerabilities, etc.? Did you see that as a positive change because so many security researchers are investing their time in making the protocol better over a period of time? Or did you see that as a distraction from the overall good?
I would lean towards your first point, right? Like I'm glad it's getting attention so that like all the the white hats of the world are taking ownership over fixing all this. And like again, like credit to all the folks doing like I was talking about it in the context of auth before, but like on the security side, like it's all intermingled in some way.
Yeah.
And like the work being done there to help mitigate all the various potential security flaws involved in MCP and LLMs in general, right? Like is a huge rabbit hole that it's going to need a lot of work. As someone part of a 2-person startup that hasn't touched an enterprise in a long time, the pains definitely hit me personally a lot less hard than I'm sure that like an IT admin at a Fortune 500 does.
Yeah.
So I'm probably not the most informed person to talk about just how bad it can be and so on and so forth. But like my general view on this technology is like, it's clear how valuable it can be. And so like, it's not a question of like, is this security flaw going to make it impossible to use? It's just a question of, how quickly can it be adopted by like the most regulated, the most sensitive industries and so on. And it's encouraging to me to see new articles talking about all this stuff, because that means like there is motivation to invest in growing that up. But I think like, it's not really like, I would never view it as like, there's an existential threat to the existence of MCP because of prompt injection. Yeah. It's just more like, okay, we just have more work to do to figure out how to hedge against it. And I think, there's all kinds of interesting stuff. Like I know, like Invariant Labs was one of the early companies that did that, and Sneak recently acquired them. So like, I think like those kind of companies and those kind of acquisitions and more resources pouring into that kind of like mitigations that can exist in tooling around that. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, especially for.
And it's actually great for the ecosystem too, because the ecosystem evolves based on all the good work that is being done by the white hat, so that exactly where to improve your protocol itself at a fundamental level.
Right.
I thought it's a great signal that MCP adoption is only going to grow in the next few months. We've been talking about as if MCP exists for the last 10 years. It's not even been 10 months since they first launched the protocol. Yeah. So one of the things that also struck me is you spoke about, hey, there are a lot of MCP servers out there, but how do you discover these MCP servers? You spoke about having, hey, we need to have a central registry so that the discovery of these MCP servers is easier. So there's some trusted versions of these MCP servers that anyone can browse through, look at, install, and use. So tell me more about that work.
I would caveat a few of those points, but let me just start from the top. I think, for context, I've been working as my primary role in the MCP steering committee is a maintainer of the official MCP registry. And so the MCP registry's goal is like you said, a centralized discovery mechanism for finding MCP servers. But I think like, I've spoken a few times about this at like the MCP Dev Summit and so on, that like, it's not the end all be all for MCP discovery. Like this MCP registry that we're building is really just like the foundational starting point building block for solving this thing. We expect like once this launches, and depending on when listeners are listening to this, it's probably already out there. But like once it's out there, there will also continue to be sub-registries of many kinds, hundreds, thousands maybe, of GitHub will have a sub-registry of some sort. Pulse MCP will continue to have a sub-registry at some point. We would expect like OpenAI, Anthropic, etc., like all the big MCP clients to have like what we would consider a sub-registry that basically ingests from this centralized upstream. So like I wouldn't expect, Joe Schmo who's trying to use an MCP server to connect to the official registry. They're just going to log into, whatever MCP client they're using. And that data happens to come from an upstream of the centralized registry, but it won't be like, it'll still be like, you're in VS Code and you're looking at the MCP marketplace in the sidebar, like that's where you're going to find it. So like that discovery will still happen there. There might be other paths too. Like you might go to pulsemcp.com and try to be like, oh, what are the most popular servers? And like, let me see if it's that one. Let me find that one on the VS Code marketplace. And so there might be like some jumping around like that, depending on like who in the free market solves the like MCP search problem the best way. I think there's also like two more points I'd want to make like on that front is like, I think like decentralized discovery is going to be a big thing. And like in the MCP Dev Summit in Europe in October, I'm going to talk a little more about this, where it's like, the future is not just the centralized mechanism, but there will also be a like .well-known URI approach to this, where when you're on a website, you should be able to go to a .well-known URI and be like, oh, this MCP server corresponds to this website.
Yeah.
And like, I'm really excited about that, because that brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Like that whole narrative of like, okay, I have this vision that like almost every website should have its own MCP server in some way, shape, or form. Like whether it's auto-generated by WordPress or whatever, or it's like Shopify's already doing this for all their clients. Yeah. So like there, in some way, shape, or form, like there should be an MCP way to connect to most websites, most services. And I think like that kind of discovery can happen through this .well-known URI. So like you actually don't even touch the MCP registry ever to get there. That said, I think like we're still a ways from like, the metric of most web, like I think the time that where they'll flip is like today, while 5% of the economy has an MCP server, it makes more sense to have a centralized registry, because it's more of a question of like, I want to use MCP when they go to the registry, or like a downstream version of it and pull it in. But I think like fast forward 5 years, when more websites have an MCP server than not, then the question is more like, well, let me just go to this well-known URI, and there's a greater than 50% chance, maybe greater than 99% chance, depending on what industry you're in, that will already exist. And so like, then you don't need the centralized registry anymore, except maybe to like, I don't know, manage version data, or whatever, or like STDIO servers, right? Like it'll be more niche thing. But so my summary of like where that is today is like, today, the centralized registry is important. It is like how the ecosystem can flourish better and deduplicate a bunch of this like fragmentation around the ecosystem, around discovery today. But in the long run, I'm more bullish on the kind of decentralized process for discovery that's similar to how the internet works today.
So it's very interesting you say that, Tadas. Like, don't you think the sub-registry concept kind of dilutes the overall value of having this one central place, like an NPM registry or a PyPI registry, where you can just go and then find any MCP server that you want, and it's somehow signed by the owner with whatever signature or whatever fields that you think is necessary to say that it came from the official sources. And having this secondary sub-registers, I want to understand more about, what are some of the value that they can add in the sub-registry, apart from, of course, the good point that you spoke about is ratings, reviews, making the discovery easier, better, etc. What is the thought process behind creating this sub-registry concept?
Yeah, and I think like I would, we can answer each of those points turn by turn, but I think like the starting point I would go from is like, all right, we're I think you and I are aligned that we are solving some very specific things with the registry, which is like MCP server authors need one place to publish, right? Like that will solve the pain of like, oh, I need to like go to Smithery and put it up here, and I need to go to I need to send to Anthropic an update about my DXT MCP server here, and then I need to email the Pulse team to update my description here. Like every time I bump a version, right? Like that's crazy, right? Like so, like this, like we're all, everyone is aligned that you just have to run one command, put it in your CI/CD process, and it should get to every MCP client out there. Right. Like that like we do want to solve that. Like absolutely a thing we should solve. And then like another thing that is nice to solve with the registry is like stuff like having like a unified like schema for how these interactions work, right? Like and we're calling it like the registry API schema. So then like whether you're connecting to, Smithery or Pulse MCP, right? Like you should be able to basically use the same SDK to pull down the data and integrate it into whatever you're trying to do downstream. Those are problems we want to solve. And so then the next question is like, okay, do we still need a sub-registry concept? And I think like the only way to like basically obviate the need for a sub-registry would then be to like try to centrally solve problems like search ranking. Like when I search XYZ, which one shows up first, second, third? And Google has built one of the biggest businesses of all time over 20 years, investing billions and billions of dollars trying to solve it. And everyone's still like, I come from an SEO background. Everyone still thinks Google does a terrible job. It's not true. They do the best job in the world, and they've built one of the biggest businesses in the world, like solving this problem. But like, it is probably the hardest problem that anyone has ever tried to solve. And I absolutely did not want that to be a part of this like volunteer-driven, steering committee type of thing that like needs to be, that it tries to be solved in like this like centralized manner. Like I think if like we could try, but I think it would go very poorly, and then like it would also discourage the free market from trying to solve it. Because if you try to solve this in like at this like top level centralized, vendor neutral thing that's like not monetized by anyone, then like all the attention will go to it, even if it's a terrible experience, right? Like if we're doing a bad job of surfacing the best search results, it will still win out the like startup that's like trying to do it better, but like, and maybe could do better in the long run, but it just doesn't have the marketing power to nudge out the like official solution. So I was very deliberate in like how we were designing this of like, we don't want to solve the search problem because it's really hard and it requires a ton of resources to do well. Other like opinionated things of like, we had some back and forth of like, oh, should we like ingest GitHub stars as like a thing that we include as part of the registry data? Because like, right now, like most MCP servers are hosted on GitHub. And so it's like, it's a useful like kind of social metric of like, oh, like is this a popular server or not? And I was also pushing back against that, and we decided to not do it because like, number one, it's like the current state of MCP is such that mostly developers are using it. So like GitHub stars make sense for most use cases and so on. But it's also like not a vendor neutral thing. Like how would GitLab feel about the ecosystem if GitHub stars were now anointed as like this thing that like, GitHub is now the MCP source of truth. So like these were some very deliberate design goals of the registry of like vendor neutral. We're not going to try to solve the like nearly impossible problems that like have proven to be extremely hard. And ultimately this like sub-registry concept kind of fans out that responsibility and creates a free market and creates a fair kind of playing field for everyone.
I think thanks for explaining that, Tadas. I think if I understood rightly, what you're saying is, as an MCP server builder, I only need to publish my MCP server details to the official MCP registry, and it's free data. Anyone can pull that information and then host kind of their own bells and whistles on top of this central data to make it more valuable for either discovery problem or search problem or ratings and reviews problem, or even an ad platform built on top of this MCP server registry. I think that's a great way of putting it. The official registry should make it easy for the server builders to share their details. But as an MCP user, I should have different ways of discovering what MCP servers are available out there, which ones I want to use. I think that's a great way of putting it.
Exactly. I think like, and it kind of speaks to MCP's roots, right? Like in solving this like M clients and servers problem, and we're not introducing this single gateway in the middle of it all, right? Like we're continuing to be like, oh, we're still like providing for N number of solutions at each step of the way, which I think is a beautiful part of the MCP kind of architecture that like I'd love to keep all the way through the stack.
Yeah. So can you speak a little bit more about the challenges that you faced while creating this MCP registry spec, especially with respect to how do you trust the authenticity of the owner? Like, for example, you built your own Stripe MCP server. I built my own Stripe MCP server. Who knows which one is actually officially built by the Stripe company itself? How did you go about solving some of these challenges? Or was that not even one of the project goals?
That was definitely a goal. I think we solved it in the most simple way possible. And credit to Justin from Anthropic. He was the one who like lobbed this idea out there and was like, I think this is probably a good idea. And we've run with it for the past 5 months since, which is we're just using reverse DNS namespaces to basically ascertain as to like, who's who in doing this. So basically, the answer to your question for like, if we both build a Stripe MCP server, which one it is, the one you publish would that be at like, you're at scalekit.com. What's your .com? So like your server would be called com.scalekit/Stripe. My server would be com.pulsemcp/Stripe. And then Stripe server would be com.stripe/Stripe or whatever they want to call it. Yeah. It is the bare minimum, but like enough of a building block for anyone who's like downstream pulling it down to be like, let's say OpenAI builds a ChatGPT marketplace built on that streams this down. They now have the tools to be like, okay, I know they've ascertained that like this is from stripe.com and this is Stripe. Like we can have our ops team be like, this is the official one. And like that will be the one that like shows up or is more prominent or whatever in the registry. And they can decide to what degree they want to make it more prominent or not. But it still like leaves the door open for like a lot of flexibility of like, there are definitely MCP servers out there where like the better MCP server, or at least the better designed one, comes from the community. Right? Like, I know like in the like, I'll give an example since they fixed it, but like in the early days, Notion's first MCP server release, it was just open API spec merged into
just MCP wrapper on top of open API.
Exactly. And it was not a good MCP server. To their credit, and I'll say this up front, their V2 is awesome, right? Like they've gone and written a whole blog post about like how they've redesigned it, how they've thought through all these things. And like that is exactly what I wanted to see happen, right? Like it was a great progression to see a bunch of companies do that. Like open API spec to get something out there, kind of get our feet wet. And now like, everyone should follow Notion's lead of like, now let's actually take a step back and like redesign from like MCP first principles. So they fixed that. But for a period of time there, it was like the official Notion MCP server is not the best Notion MCP server. Like these handful of other ones that like of people are thinking more thoughtfully about this problem were better. And I think like in many cases, right, like that's not always going to be the case, right? Like the official ones will often catch up and like in general, like the official ones are incentivized to get better. But I do think that like leaving the flexibility in the ecosystem for like kind of, everyone who's ingesting this data to present it in their own way, to sort it in their own way, to elevate certain servers above others in their own way and not trying to centralize the solution is part of the beauty of it.
Yeah, I think that also explains how you spoke about the registry and sub-registry. Having the ownership, it's an official tag that this came from the company, but that need not necessarily be the best server, and let each of the sub-registries determine who should be more prominent or who should be more discoverable for a given particular problem statement. I think it also speaks to that goal that you spoke about earlier as part of the MCP registry spec evolution itself. Tadas, if a developer is out there building an MCP server, I know you spoke about don't just convert your open API into an MCP server wrapper. What do you think that they need to think about while they're building an MCP server for their company, for their product?
I'm so glad you asked. I have so many opinions on this. Like my general advice, and I hear this question talked about a lot. And I think like, I was a reviewer for the MCP Dev Summit conference coming up in October here. And like, there were probably about 10 talks submitted about like tool design, which is awesome. Like, I'm glad everyone is talking about that now. Like, this is great. My thinking on the ideal process for like designing your MCP server is like, you drop your engineering hat, forget about engineering, put on your like product manager hat. Basically, like this is like, and like I think a lot of companies are doing this whole ecosystem a disservice by being like, oh, we need MCP, let's put our engineers on it. I think what you actually should do is we need an MCP server, put my product managers on it, because like the way to build an MCP server is to start with the use cases. It's to think about like, all right, number one, like what clients are MCP clients our users in our target market actually going to be using? Are they actually going to Claude Desktop? Are they actually going to ChatGPT? Or are they engineers using Claude Code and Codex, right? Like, where's the starting point? And like, because like without that starting point, you don't have a user journey. So you start with the starting point. Like, what are the clients that they're doing this with? And like, what is the capability we have like, in our SaaS, in our service, whatever our bread and butter is, that we can augment that experience for them. And then like do your traditional product management tactics of like write your user stories, your use cases, create your personas, write about like, it's engineers, data engineers, site reliability engineers, or whoever it is. What are they trying to do? And then design the most like I think the most interesting thing about like how this is all like, especially I'm talking specifically about tool design, but like, you can apply this thinking as well to all the other primitives as well. But like with like tool design specifically, for example, LLMs are so powerful in being able to like distinguish like when they should do X versus Y. Like you don't need nearly as much granularity as like a typical open API spec does. So like instead of giving like 20 different create, read, update, delete endpoints on all your like basic building blocks, what you're actually probably doing is defining like one, like many MCP servers I think should be one tool.
Oh, wow.
That's my hot take.
Wow.
Many MCP, like unless you're a big company who has like, 20 different products, right? Then obviously you might want to consider splitting that into separate MCP servers. But point being, like, if you're like a startup that like has like one unique value prop, there's a pretty good chance that I think you can probably put a lot of that functionality into one tool. So like, shout out to one super early stage startup that a friend of mine runs called Poku Labs. Like they have two tools in their MCP server, but like each one represents like very specific functionality. Like one of them is like request approval from human, right, to proceed. And like it's a very complex tool because on the back end they have this whole like Twilio thing going on where like it sends a message to the human and it gets a response, and so like there's this whole product behind that one little concept of like request approval from human. But like I think it's like, and my hot take is that like, oh, it should be one. I'm sure this is not general advice, like it doesn't apply to every single case, but I think that's a good example of one that where like you pack a whole lot of punch behind a whole simple tool, and like they don't need request approval from human to via text, request approval from human via XYZ. Right? Like maybe it's a parameter, probably not even though. Like it's probably a configuration somewhere in the SaaS, right? Like you're probably, as someone using that tool, like you're probably doing it the same way every time. So like you don't need a LLM to decide every time. So anyway, in summary, I think like the advice is start with your personas, start with your use cases, figure out not the like technical like CRUD operations that need to happen, but rather the like kind of LLM friendly descriptions of the like feature packed stuff that you might do on the back end in a long sequence. And then design your MCP server based on.
I think it's a great advice, Tadas. I completely agree with you that again, what we advise our customers is, hey, think of what actions do you want the users to take using your MCP server. You don't expect LLM to construct a series of read that data, read that dependent API, do this dependent, and then construct that action. Rather, make it easy for LLM to say, hey, there's this one tool. If you want to create a new subscription in Stripe, for example, that just be the tool. So LLM always predictably selects that tool for that particular job based on the context. So think like a product manager, think of your customer, figure out what actions do you want them to do, and just only expose them. You can wrap whatever you want behind the scenes that are predictable workflows, but make sure that you're, I wouldn't say one tool, but as few tools as possible to the MCP client.
Yeah, that's fair. I can see I'm probably being dramatic with the one tool. Less tools, I will stand by that.
Please don't expose your open API to the LLM and then ask it to figure out the dance. Tadas, one last question. How do you see the future of Pulse MCP with all this MCP registry work going on? And you're also using Pulse MCP as a way to educate your customers about, hey, what are the ecosystem changes that are happening around MCP? So what does the future for Pulse MCP hold?
Yeah, so and I think I don't have a super concrete answer for you because we still consider ourselves early stage startup, 2 people. Like I might change our strategy next week, but I'll give you the current thinking. And for context, if listeners haven't heard about it, like a big thing I spend my time doing every week is write this weekly Pulse newsletter. So I spend like the entire Monday basically just 10 hours just like reviewing and banging out all this like updates on everything that's going on from like AI general news and how that funnels down to like the MCP ecosystem and things like that. So I spend a lot of my time doing that, and I plan to continue doing that probably forever. Well, I don't know about forever, but like many years, let's say, because people love it. Like I get so many amazing testimonials from people that are just like, this is like the best newsletter of like AI. And it's probably a little dramatic, but I'm pretty proud of it.
I'll take it.
I'll take it. But so like, we're going to keep doing that. I think at some point we'll probably start introducing some sort of sponsorship layer to that. And so that we can make it a more sustainable business. So that will be a big branch of what Pulse MCP does, the newsletter, updating people and so on. I think like as like, you know, in line with that sponsorship thing, like Mike, my co-founder, and I, we're both marketers, or we spend a lot of time in marketing. I spent half my career in marketing. He spent most of his career in marketing. And one thing we think we're good at is helping people bring solutions to market, technical solutions to market. And so like whether that's like by, you know, the very simple thing of like inserting sponsorships into a newsletter, or it's more high touch. Like we recently did a partnership with Goose, the MCP client, where they paid us to work with them on this massive guide on like using Goose effectively to build agents. So I think like we're exploring like doing more partnerships like that. So if you're listening and you're interested, like happy to have chats about that too. But like helping like more long form, engaged, maybe even interactive, well-designed guides, and kind of in like a kind of publisher media-esque kind of way to help people bring their AI and MCP solutions to market. That's something we might engage pretty heavily on. And I think those are like the most likely paths that I feel like Pulse will keep going. Kind of this like kind of just almost like media publication type of thing. Yeah. But you know, as an engineer, I love tinkering and all this stuff too. So like we're experimenting with like building some MCP servers. We have like a repo of ones that are kind of in the experimental stages. Yeah. And we intend to continue to maintain the registry and see what kind of value we can create as like a sub-registry. We have like some interesting data. Like we like track like estimated downloads that use all these like social signals and stuff that we ingest. And I think we may or may not be able to turn that into product. Maybe we'll just keep it like as a community resource indefinitely. So all those things put together, I think, you know, if nothing else, the newsletter could just keep growing indefinitely, and we love doing that. So that's the big thing for us.
Does your newsletter have an MCP server?
The newsletter does not, but we will probably have like in that bucket of experimental servers, we'll probably have a pulsemcp.com server at some point. So it will be included.
On that note, thank you so much, Tadas. It's great to have you here, and thank you so much for sharing all the details about the good work that you're doing on the official MCP registry and the Pulse MCP. We are huge fans of Pulse MCP. I think you're doing a lot of good stuff about educating the builders about what they should do and what they shouldn't do. I wish you all the best in the future endeavors.
Thanks so much, Ravi. This was a fun chat. I'm glad we got to have it.
Thank you so much.